Babies are born with very few capacities, so they need to work very hard and rely on whatever feedback they can get to improve their developing skills. For example, when learning to speak, toddlers use auditory, but also visual and proprioceptive cues to correctly associate a speech movement to a specific speech sound. In doing so, children compare their own speech, spoken and heard, and those of their environment to build and improve the relationship between speech they hear, see, and feel. As adults, we still rely on the multimodal nature of speech. For instance, in noisy environments like in a cocktail party, we tend to look at the talker's face and use lip reading to recover speech sound. Also, when interacting with someone that speaks a different language, we tend to speak more clearly by opening our mouth wider to make ourselves more understandable. Then what happens in case of blindness? Of course, there's no doubt that blind speakers learn to produce intelligible speech. However, considering the fact that they do not perceive others' visual cues, it's safe to say that they haven't built their speech units the same way sighted speakers did. In fact, it has been shown that blind speakers pay more attention on what they hear than their sighted peers. Why? Because the brain regions normally dedicated to vision are not shut down. They are simply involved in the processing of different sensory information, mainly auditory. For my master's thesis, I asked myself, if blind and sighted speakers perceive speech differently, is the relationship between what they perceive and produce also different? To answer this question, we asked blind and sighted speakers to produce multiple utterances of the French sound While doing that, and without them knowing it, we gradually shifted their auditory feedback through a headphone to a point where they were not hearing the exact sound they were saying. At that point, the sound they produce sounded like A to them. Therefore, to hear the sound they were asked to produce, they needed to adapt the way they spoke in order to compensate to the acoustic shift. Blind speakers not being able to rely on visual feedback, we assumed that they would focus more on the auditory feedback and therefore compensate to a greater extent. As predicted, even though everyone adapted their speech to the acoustic shift, blind compensated sooner and much more than the sighted did, as if they were integrating the auditory information more strongly. By comparing the produced sound and the lips and tongue movement between the two groups, we found that blind speakers wanted to match their auditory goals so badly, they used extreme articulatory strategies that went beyond the normal acoustic articulatory association. On the other hand, sighted speakers stopped compensating their production when they reached their proprioceptive limits, this motor feedback being clearly of higher importance to them. So, to answer our main question, it seems that the fact that blind and sighted speakers perceive speech differently does affect the relationship between perceived and produced speech. The privileged sensory information being different for both groups, the emphasis on achieving either perceptual or production goals is also different. Thanks to the CRSH, this project helped not only understand the complex processes underlying speech abilities, but also recognize the delicate relationship between the different perceptual senses involved in this day-to-day activity. My name is Pamela Trudeau Fisette, and I am now a Ph.D. student at the Université du Québec à Montréal.